August of 1887 came late to the western slope of the Colorado Divide, and by the time the aspens along Beaver Creek had begun turning the color of new copper, most men in the Silver Line mining camp were already thinking about winter wages, whiskey, and the long ride back down to Denver before the passes closed. But one man was thinking about none of those things. 10 paces from the door of a low cedar log cabin set against a stand of black timber, an old trapper named John Ashcroft was on his knees in the dirt, digging a hole large enough to bury a wagon in. He was 61 years old that summer, though the mountains had aged him past reckoning. His beard reached nearly to the middle of his chest, streaked gray and white like frost on wet stone. His skin was the color of tanned leather where the sun had found it, and pale beneath the collar of his wool Henley where it had not. His eyes were an unnerving pale blue, the color of glacier ice under afternoon light, and they had the steady quietness of a man who had watched too many winters take too many men. A rough-coated gray husky named Sitka lay in the pine shadow beside him, watching him work without opinion, the way only a dog who has followed a trap line for 11 seasons can watch a man. John was digging a pit, not a well, not a grave, a pit, 4 feet deep and 8 feet across, cut in a broad square through the dry brown loam of the meadow and down into the cooler undersoil beneath. He had been at it for 11 days already, an hour or two each morning before the sun climbed high enough to punish the back of his neck, and another hour or two after supper when the light softened toward the west. It was slow work for a man his age, and he did not hurry it. Winter would arrive when winter chose to arrive, and until then, the ground would move at whatever pace an old man's shoulders could move it. If you enjoy forgotten frontier wisdom, the quiet stories of men who prepared while others laughed, and true tales where the mountains themselves become the final judge, take a moment now to subscribe, leave a like, and stay through to the very end. Because what old John Ashcroft was burying in that hole above Beaver Creek would eventually feed 34 souls through the worst winter the Colorado Divide had seen in living memory. And the men who had laughed the loudest at his digging would be the same men who came, hats in their frozen hands, begging at his cabin door. The trouble was that Silver Line Camp sat on a small plateau above the creek where a narrow-gauge spur line ran up from the main railroad 40 miles below. Copper and a little silver came out of the shaft. Provisions, whiskey, coal oil, sugar, coffee, salt pork, and dried beans came in on that same spur every 2 weeks like clockwork. The camp store was operated by a Missouri man named Pettigrew who kept a red-painted sign nailed above his door reading "Store well stocked year-round," and the miners believed him, because in 6 seasons of camp life, the spur line had never once failed to come through. 6 seasons was long enough, for most men, to mistake a habit for a law. John Ashcroft did not believe in habits, and he did not believe in laws that had not first been proven by weather. He had come into the Rockies in the fall of 1843, a boy of 17 with a Kentucky rifle and no clear idea of what he was running from, and by the winter of 1846, he had run a trap line for beaver, marten, and fisher along the headwaters of the North Platte and the upper Yampa for 3 full seasons on his own. He had learned in that time that the mountains kept no promises. A creek that ran clear in October could be 12 feet under a snow bridge by December. A pass that a mule could cross in September could kill a man on foot by November. The country was beautiful, and it was patient, and every so often it decided to remind whoever lived on it that beauty and patience were not the same as kindness. He had learned other things too in those early years, and most of them he had learned from a Blackfoot woman named Charlotte. That was not her true name, of course. Her true name was one he had never been able to say correctly in her own tongue, though he had tried for 2 winters, and she had laughed at him with real kindness each time he tried. The traders on the Missouri had given her the English name Charlotte when she was a girl, and she had kept it because it made the white men easier to deal with, and John had used it because she had asked him to. They had lived together in a lodge on the Sun River for 3 winters and part of a 4th, and in that 4th winter she had died of a fever that took her in 9 days, and John had buried her beneath a cairn of river stones and had come south alone, and had never spoken her name aloud to another living person in the 41 years since. But he had not forgotten what she taught him. She had taught him how to read the ice on a slow creek. She had taught him which lichens were safe to boil when the meat was gone and the snow was still 6 weeks deep. And she had taught him, one long August afternoon in 1845, how her people cached food in the ground against the coming cold. She had taken him out onto the flat above the river and shown him how to dig the pit wide and shallow rather than narrow and deep, how to line the bottom with dry grass and cedar bark, how to stack the parfleche bundles and the dried meat and the pemmican in careful layers, how to cover each layer with straw and then a hand's breadth of packed earth, how to build the whole thing so that when the ground froze solid above it, the cache became a kind of natural icebox that no wolf could reach and no thief could find and no thaw could spoil. He had cached food that way every winter of his trapping life since. In lean years, it had kept him alive twice. In fat years, it had kept his dogs fed through February when everything else ran short. And now, in his 61st summer, sitting on a plateau above Beaver Creek with the copper mine coughing smoke a mile down the ridge and the whistle of the supply train sounding twice a month like a promise from the flatlands, John Ashcroft was digging a Blackfoot pit cache in the meadow behind his cabin. He had begun the digging in the second week of July, when the ground was dry enough to take a spade cleanly, and he worked at it every day the weather allowed. By the first week of August, the pit was finished. He had lined the bottom with a foot of coarse gravel he had hauled up by the bucket from the creek bed for drainage, because Charlotte had told him once that the surest way to lose a cache was to let groundwater rise into it during the autumn rains. Above the gravel he had laid dry cedar bark he had peeled himself from windfall trees along the ridge, and above the bark, a thick mat of last year's meadow grass that he had cut, dried, and stored in the loft of his cabin the previous September for exactly this purpose. He had planned the pit for 2 years before he ever put a spade to earth. That was how his mind worked. The provisions themselves he had built up slowly across the whole summer. Smoked venison first, because he had taken a young bull elk in the second week of June and had spent 4 days working the meat over a slow alder fire until it was as dry and dark as tack leather. Then salted pork, 12 slabs of it, brought up on the spur line from Denver in June and packed in coarse rock salt inside heavy oak barrels sealed with pitch. Then 2 barrels of dried tubers, potatoes and turnips and a little wild parsnip he had dug himself along the lower meadows. Then rendered tallow in stone crocks, because tallow kept a man's lamp burning and his stomach quiet when nothing else was left. Then pemmican, 3 canvas-wrapped bundles of it, made the old way with dried meat pounded fine and folded together with rendered fat and dried service berries he had picked along the creek in early July. He had packed all of it into wooden crates, 10 of them, each one lined with more of the dried meadow grass, and each one wrapped on its outer sides with burlap sacking from the store. He stacked the crates in 3 careful tiers inside the pit, leaving a hand's breadth of packed straw between each crate and each wall, and he set the barrels of pork and dried tubers upright in the corners where the earth would freeze around them hardest and hold them coldest. When the stacking was done, he laid a heavy oiled canvas across the top, then more straw a foot deep, and then, at the very last, a full 2 feet of packed earth mounded gently above ground level so that the snow would shed off it rather than settle into a puddle come thaw. He marked the 4 corners of the buried pit with 4 flat stones he could find again by feel under 6 feet of snow if he had to. It took him the whole month of August to finish, and it took him most of the first 2 weeks of September to smooth the ground above it and let the grass begin to knit back over the disturbed earth. And it was during those weeks, while he was still working the last of it, that the miners and the railroad hands began to notice. They came past his cabin often enough, on their way up to the higher meadows to cut hay for the mule string, or down toward the creek for a Sunday afternoon of trout fishing when the shift schedules allowed. And they saw the mound of fresh earth, and they began to talk. The first ones were harmless enough. A pair of Cornish miners named Trewin and Palgley stopped by on a Sunday afternoon in early September on their way back from the creek with a string of small brook trout, and they leaned on the split-rail fence at the edge of John's yard and called out to him where he stood tamping the last of the earth over the pit with the flat of his spade. What was he planting? They wanted to know. Was it potatoes for a spring crop, or was it something else? John looked up at them from under the brim of his felt hat and said only that he was putting food by for the winter. The two Cornishmen looked at each other, and Trewin, who had a red beard and a slow smile, said that Pettigrew's store did that job well enough for the rest of them and asked whether John had lost his faith in the railroad. John said he had never had faith in the railroad to begin with. The Cornishmen laughed, waved, and walked on down the trail toward camp. By the middle of the week, the story had gone through the camp twice. The old trapper up on the ridge was burying his provisions in the ground. Some said he was burying money too, gold dust from his younger years, and that the food was only a cover story for the coin beneath it. Others said he had gone soft in the head, the way lone men sometimes did after too many winters by themselves, and that he was hoarding against a famine that only existed inside his own skull. A wagon driver named Kellerman came up the ridge one afternoon on the pretext of borrowing a whetstone, and stood in the yard long enough to look hard at the mound of fresh dirt and the 4 flat cornerstones. And when he rode back down to camp that evening, he told the men in the saloon that old John was digging his own grave 2 years early and marking the corners so the priest could find it. The jokes hardened over the next week. Men would call across the yard as they rode past. "How deep's the gold today, John?" one would shout. "Buried any bank robbers up there this morning?" another would call. A young Irish miner named Doolin, who fancied himself the wit of the camp, took to referring to John's cabin as the Ashcroft National Bank and would tip his cap gravely whenever he passed the front gate. John did not answer any of it. He would look up from whatever work his hands were doing, meet the caller's eye once, and go back to his work. Sitka, the husky, would sometimes rise from the porch and stand watching until the rider had passed, and then she would lie down again and put her chin on her paws and close her eyes. It was the preacher who troubled John most, though John never let it show. His name was Joseph Merrick, and he had come up to Silverline in the spring on a horse and mule circuit that ran from Leadville to Aspen and back through the smaller camps in between. He was 26 years old, a lean man with a hollow-cheeked earnestness and the pale, watery blue eyes of someone who had grown up reading by lamplight. He preached in the mess tent every second Sunday, and he took his duty seriously, and he took the souls of the Silverline camp more seriously still. Joseph Merrick came up the ridge to John's cabin on the 3rd Sunday of September, just after the noon meal, on a borrowed bay mare with a white blaze down its nose. He tied the mare to the fence rail and walked across the yard with his Bible held in both hands the way a schoolboy carries a slate, and John, who had been splitting kindling on a stump near the porch, straightened up and set the axe down and waited for him to come. Sitka watched from the porch shade with her ears half flat but her mouth closed. She had learned long ago the difference between men who meant harm and men who only meant to talk. The preacher stopped 6 feet away and took his hat off politely and said good afternoon, and John nodded and said the same. There was a moment of silence in which Joseph seemed to be gathering something, and then he said, straight out, that he had come because he was troubled in his conscience, and he believed John ought to hear him. John said that a man was welcome to speak his mind on his own 2 feet in John's yard, and Joseph took a small breath and began. He said he had heard the talk about the buried provisions. He said he did not believe what the men in the saloon believed, that it was gold or madness or foolishness. He believed John was a serious man who was doing a serious thing, but he had come to say, with respect, that hoarding was a sin. He said the book was clear on it. He quoted from the 6th chapter of Matthew about laying up treasures on earth where moth and rust corrupt. He quoted the parable of the rich fool who tore down his barns to build bigger ones and whose soul was required of him that same night. He said that when a man buried food while his neighbors depended on the common provision of the camp store, He was setting himself above his neighbors, and he was placing his trust in his own hand rather than in the providence that fed the sparrows of the field. He said all of this quietly and without heat, and when he was done he stood with his hat in his hands and waited. John looked at him for a long moment. The wind moved through the tops of the lodgepoles behind the cabin, and somewhere down the ridge a mule brayed twice and went quiet. Sitka had not moved. Finally John said that he had heard the preacher out, and that he thanked him for the trouble of the ride up, and that he did not intend to argue scripture with a man who had studied it longer than he had. But he said also that he had lived in these mountains since before the preacher's father had been born, and that he had seen the country do things to men who trusted the wrong thing, and that he did not believe the railroad was Providence, and he did not believe Pettigrew's store was the widow's cruse of oil, and he would go on doing what an old life in cold country had taught him to do. Joseph nodded slowly, as if he had expected the answer, and he said he would pray for John. John said he would be obliged. The preacher put his hat back on and walked to his mare and mounted and rode back down the trail toward camp, and John stood in his yard and watched him go until the bay had passed the last bend, and then he picked up the axe and went back to splitting kindling. The last week of September went by warm and dry, and October came in gold and mild, and by the first week of November the aspens had dropped their leaves and the first light snow had frosted the north-facing slopes above the camp. Nothing about the weather that autumn spoke of what was coming. The supply train came in on schedule on the second Tuesday of November, unloaded at the spur, and rolled back down toward the flatlands with a car full of copper ore and 2 passenger seats occupied by miners who had drawn their pay and decided to winter in Denver. Pettigrew's store took delivery of 40 barrels of flour, 20 of salt pork, sacks of coffee and sugar and dried beans, cases of tinned peaches from California, and 3 barrels of whiskey. The red-painted sign above his door still read "Store well stocked year-round," and no man in Silverline had any reason to doubt it. The storm came in on the 22nd of November. It came the way the worst mountain storms come, without preamble or courtesy. The morning was clear and cold with a hard blue sky, and by noon a wall of gray had risen over the divide to the west, and by the middle of the afternoon the wind was tearing down out of the passes with a sound John Ashcroft had heard perhaps 4 times in his whole life. He knew that sound. He had gone out into the yard when it began, and he had stood a long moment listening to it before he brought Sitka inside and barred the shutters over the 2 small windows of his cabin and threw a second armload of split pine onto the fire. He said aloud to the dog, though the dog gave no sign of understanding, that this one was going to be bad. By nightfall it was worse than bad. The temperature, which had stood at 18 degrees above zero at noon, dropped through zero by 6 in the evening and kept dropping. The wind rose to a scream that rattled the door on its leather hinges and drove fine snow through cracks in the shutter joints that John had not known existed. He stuffed the cracks with strips of wool blanket by lamplight and banked the fire, and sat up until well past midnight with Sitka curled at his feet, listening to the mountain doing something the mountain had not done in a generation. When he finally lay down on his rope-strung bunk to sleep, the thermometer nailed to the outside of his door post read 24 degrees below zero, and the wind had not slackened by a single note. The storm ran for 4 days. When it finally broke, on the morning of the 26th, the sky was a strange, thin, milky color and the wind had died to almost nothing, and John opened his door onto a world he did not entirely recognize. The snow had drifted to the eaves on the north side of the cabin. The woodpile, which had stood 6 feet high against the south wall the week before, was buried to within a foot of its top. His outhouse was gone, or rather, only the peak of its roof was visible above a smooth white curve of drift. Beyond the yard, the meadow was a rolling white sea, and the trail down to camp had disappeared entirely. He put on his oiled canvas duster and his fur-topped mucklucks, and he took a shovel down from the wall and he began, slowly and methodically, to dig himself out. The temperature did not rise above zero for 41 days. That was the count John Ashcroft kept, in pencil, on the back of an old ledger page nailed above his workbench. One small tick mark for each morning, he stepped out onto his porch and read the thermometer, and found the mercury still crouched below the line. He had lived through cold snaps of 2 weeks and 3 weeks in his younger years on the Sun River, and he had heard old traders speak of a month once in the winter of 1856. He had never seen 41 days, and he had never known any man who had. Down in the camp, the trouble began in the second week. The spur line had gone under the storm entirely, and when a crew of 6 men from the mine tried to walk out along the grade toward the main line with picks and shovels and a mule sled, they came back on the third day with 2 of the mules' feet frostbitten, and the report that the cut through Hangman's Gap was buried under 30 feet of hard-packed drift, and there was no clearing it with hand tools before spring. The telegraph wire was down somewhere between camp and the flatlands, and no one could raise Denver, and the last locomotive that had come up the spur was still sitting at the Silver Line platform with its water tank frozen solid and split down one side. Pettigrew's store held out for 3 weeks and 1 day. He rationed from the first to his credit, and he did not gouge on prices until the very end, when the flour barrels were showing their bottoms and the salt pork was down to the last 2 slabs. The miners took to eating 1 meal a day, then 1 meal every other day. The mine shut down on the 15th of December because there was not enough food in the mess to feed men doing that kind of work, and after that the camp simply sat in the cold and waited, and the waiting was the worst of it, because a man with nothing to do in a cabin at 30 below has only his own hunger to think about. The first man to die was a Welsh timberman named Owen Price. He had come down with a fever in the second week of December, and there was no doctor closer than Leadville, and by the time the fever broke on the 21st of December, he was too weak to eat what little was still being served in the mess. He died on Christmas Eve in the bunkhouse he shared with 4 other Welshmen, and they could not bury him because the ground was frozen 4 feet deep, and they laid him in the tool shed behind the assay office and closed the door. The second man was Kellerman, the wagon driver who had ridden up to John's yard in September and told the saloon that old John was digging his own grave. He froze to death on the 3rd of January. He had gone out at dusk to bring in an armload of wood from the pile behind his cabin, and something had happened, a slip, a fall, a heart that had had enough. They found him at first light the next morning 6 feet from his own door, curled on his side in the snow with the wood still cradled against his chest. The temperature that night had reached 38 degrees below zero. 2 men were dead, and it was only the first week of January, and the whole camp knew now, without saying it, that more would follow if something did not change. Joseph Merrick came up the ridge on the 6th of January. He came on foot, because there was no fodder left in camp for the horses, and the bay mare was standing hollow-flanked in a stall behind the mess. He walked the 2 miles from the last cabin at the edge of camp up the switchback trail through snow that came to his knees in the packed places and to his hips in the drifts, and it took him from just after dawn until nearly noon to do it. He had eaten a heel of cornbread that morning and drunk a cup of hot water with a pinch of salt in it, and that was all the food that had passed his lips in 2 days. John saw him coming from a long way off. He had been out at the woodpile splitting a section of dry lodgepole, and he stopped with the axe resting on the block and watched the small dark figure struggling up the last switchback toward the cabin. He knew who it was before he could see the face. There was no other man in Silver Line Camp who would have made that walk alone in that cold on that day, and John understood, without any satisfaction in the understanding, why the preacher had come. Joseph stopped at the fence rail where he had tied his mare 4 months before. He did not open the gate. He stood with one gloved hand on the top rail and he waited, and when John set the axe down and walked across the yard to meet him, the young man's face was the color of tallow, and his lips were cracked and bleeding at the corners, and his eyes had the flat glaze of a man who had not slept properly in a long time. He tried to speak and his voice would not come. He tried again. He said John's name, And then he said that Kellerman was dead and Owen Price was dead, and that there were 3 children in the Bell cabin down by the creek who had not eaten a full meal in 9 days, and that Pettigrew's shelves were empty except for 2 sacks of coffee and a barrel of pickled beets, and that he had come, God help him, to ask a thing he had no right to ask. John looked at him a long moment. The wind moved along the ridge and lifted a fine curtain of loose snow off the drift beside the cabin and let it fall again. Sitka had come out from the porch and was standing at John's left knee with her tail low and her ears forward, watching the preacher with the same steady attention she gave to everything. John said only, "Come inside first. You'll die on the porch if you talk from there." He turned and walked back to the cabin, and Joseph followed him. Inside, John sat the preacher down on the 3-legged stool by the fire and put a tin cup of hot broth into his hands. Made from bone stock, John had drawn off a smoked venison shank that morning, and he stood over him while Joseph drank it in slow sips, because a man who has been that cold and that hungry cannot drink hot broth quickly without being sick. He did not speak while Joseph drank. He did not need to. When the cup was empty, he took it from the young man's hands and set it on the table and said quietly, "Now, tell me what the camp needs." And Joseph told him. John listened to it all without a word. When the preacher had finished, he stood a long moment looking at the fire, and then he took his hat from the peg by the door and his oiled canvas duster from the hook beside it, and he said to Joseph that the young man could stay by the fire until his color came back, and then he would need to walk with John out to the meadow. Joseph asked what was in the meadow. John said only that the preacher would see. An hour later, the 2 of them stood at the 4 flat cornerstones, and John had a pickaxe in his hands, and Joseph was looking down at what appeared to be nothing at all, only a smooth white curve of drift over the meadow grass. John set the point of the pickaxe against the crust and drove it down with the whole weight of his shoulders behind it. The frozen top layer of earth broke with a sound like a rifle shot in the still air. He struck again, and Joseph, understanding at last, dropped to his knees and began pulling the broken chunks of frozen sod away with his hands. Neither of them spoke. It took them the better part of an hour to open a hole 2 feet across down through the packed earth and the straw and the oiled canvas beneath. And when John finally lifted the corner of the canvas back and Joseph saw what lay beneath it in the lamplight, the young preacher sat down hard in the snow and put his face in his gloved hands and wept. John did not remark on it. He climbed down into the pit and set his shoulder to the first barrel and rolled it up onto the packed straw, and Joseph, wiping his face with the back of his glove, came down to help him. Between them they got 2 barrels of salted pork and 1 crate of smoked venison out of the pit, and onto a hand sledge John had waiting behind the cabin, and John hitched Sitka into the sled harness he had built for her years ago for exactly this kind of hauling. And the 3 of them, the old man and the young preacher and the gray husky pulling steady in her traces, started down the switchback trail toward Silverline Camp in the blue cold of the winter afternoon. They fed 30 men and 4 women out of that pit for 6 weeks. John took charge of the rationing himself, because he knew what a body needed to survive that kind of cold and what a body only wanted, and he was not willing to let a hungry camp eat through his cash in 2 weeks and then starve for 4. He set up a common kitchen in the mess tent and put Joseph in charge of serving it, and every morning at first light he came down the trail with Sitka pulling a fresh load on the sledge, and every evening he went back up. He gave out smoked venison and salted pork and boiled tubers and pemmican and rendered tallow for the lamps, and he asked no payment for any of it, and he said no word, not one, about the jokes in the saloon or the preacher's sermon in his yard or the mound of fresh earth that had once been the subject of the camp's amusement. The men who had laughed the loudest ate at the same table as everyone else, and John looked them in the eye when he passed them the plate, and that was all. The temperature broke at last on the 7th of February. The mercury climbed above 0 on the 7th, and above 10 by the 9th, and by the middle of February a warm wind was coming up out of the south at midday, and the icicles along the eaves of the mess tent were dripping for the first time in 11 weeks. The spur line was still buried, and would be buried until April, but a party of 8 men on snowshoes made it out through Hangman's Gap in the 3rd week of February with a request for relief. And the relief came 2 weeks later on a mule string, carrying flour and beans and coffee, and the news that Denver had thought Silver Line Camp was lost entirely. By the time the first supply wagon rolled up the cleared spur in late April, John Ashcroft's pit was empty, and the meadow above his cabin had begun to green again, where the drift had melted off the disturbed earth. He asked only one thing of the camp, and he asked it of Joseph rather than of the men directly, because he understood the difference between a debt owed to a preacher and a debt owed to a trapper. He said that his trap line, which had run for 11 seasons along the upper Beaver Creek drainage before his shoulders had given out on him the winter before, needed rebuilding. New sets, new cubbies, new deadfalls, the sluice boxes along the creek repaired, and the cabin at the far end of the line re-roofed. He said that if 30 men could give him 1 full week of their labor in the last dry weeks of May, before the mine reopened, he would call the account settled and never speak of it again. Joseph carried the message down to camp, and 34 men came up the ridge on the first Monday of June with axes and hammers and coils of new wire and shovels, and they worked the line for 6 full days, and when they were done, John walked the whole length of it with Sitka at his heel and found it better than he had left it. He never told any of them about Charlotte. He never told the preacher, who came up to visit him twice a month for the rest of that summer and often stayed to supper. And he never told the miners who tipped their caps to him now when they passed on the trail. And he never told the new store clerk who replaced Pettigrew in the autumn. But once, on a warm evening in late August, sitting on his porch with Sitka lying across his boots and the light going long and gold across the meadow, he looked out toward the 4 flat cornerstones, and he said her name aloud for the first time in 42 years. He said it quietly, and only the dog heard him, and the dog only lifted her head once and set it down again. He had named the pit after her from the first spade of earth he turned, though he had never spoken the name to another living soul, and the pit had done what she had taught him a pit could do, and 34 people were alive because of a lesson given to a young man by a young woman on a summer afternoon on the Sun River in 1845. The mountain did not care whose wisdom kept a camp alive. It only tested whether the wisdom worked. And before you go, leave a comment below. What piece of quiet, unshowy preparation do you think the modern world has forgotten how to respect? Like the video, share it with someone who needs to hear it, and subscribe for more true stories from the frontier.